Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to be walking you through this material today. We often just kind of assume that the daily news is a simple mirror, right? Just accurately reflecting reality back at us. But the truth is actually way more complex, especially when you're looking at transitional democracies. Today, we're going to unpack the source material and uncover the hidden structural dynamics, the secret filters, basically, that dictate exactly what news we end up seeing in South Africa. We're literally looking at the architecture of power itself, so let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the Global South's fourth estate. Then, ownership and advertising filters. Third, we'll cover sourcing, flack, and enemies. And finally, the threat of state capture. All right, part one, the Global South's fourth estate. Okay, let's dive right into this. In democratic governance, you always hear the media being heralded as the fourth estate. It's supposed to act as this unofficial branch of power that's explicitly designed to scrutinize the state and maintain democratic accountability. It's the ultimate watchdog, right? It's meant to bark the second power oversteps its bounds. But as you've probably guessed, this highly idealized concept isn't nearly as simple as it sounds in theory. Because, look, an ideal media boasts absolute independence. It freely scrutinizes the state without any fear or favor. But the gritty reality, that independence is heavily dictated by structural dynamics, market pressures, and flat-out political interference. In the South African context, and really in a lot of transitional democracies, the media system has had to evolve. It moved away from being a direct, blunt tool of state control, only to land smack in the middle of a totally different, highly complex ecosystem full of overlapping pressures. And that brings us directly to the core of our source text for today. To really figure out what's going on under the hood here, we're going to be applying an academic framework known as the propaganda model. To truly grasp how South African media actually influences democratic accountability, we have to systematically break down the different filters that shape exactly what pieces of news manage to reach the public. Which brings us to Section 2, Ownership and Advertising Filters. So, research into global media systems points to a pretty stark reality. Corporate conglomerates often prioritize bottom-line considerations over public interest journalism, and that essentially creates what's called a private ministry of information. This is our first major structural dynamic, concentrated ownership. When just a handful of massive firms or parent companies dominate the mass media, they essentially hold the power to set the entire national agenda. In South Africa, legacy media continues to grapple with this exact tension every single day, trying to genuinely serve the public interest while also having to balance the very real, short-term financial interests of private corporations. But here's the thing, ownership is really just the first hurdle. Advertising acts as a massive second filter. Think about it. For media outlets to remain economically viable, to literally just keep the lights on, they have to attract audiences. But not just any audience. They desperately need the specific audiences that advertisers want to reach. This financial dynamic is so incredibly powerful that it effectively gives advertisers a de facto licensing authority over what media is even allowed to exist and thrive. Now, what's really interesting about this is how it skews the content. Because advertisers strictly want to reach people with disposable income, media houses heavily prioritize content that caters to the buying mood of an affluent, middle-class target audience. The totally devastating side effect of this financial need is that it systematically filters out marginalized voices. The critical, everyday concerns of the poor and the working class are just pushed aside, simply because they don't fit the economic model of the media outlet. Moving on to Section 3, Sourcing, Flank, and Enemies. The third filter of the propaganda model revolves completely around official sourcing. Media organizations have daily deadlines, they have tight budgets, therefore, they end up relying heavily on government and corporate bureaucracies for a steady, cheap stream of credible information. And this creates a deeply symbiotic relationship. The media gets its daily content quota filled, and the institutions get to blast their narratives out to the public. However, relying this heavily on official sources inherently limits critical inquiry. Why? Because you rarely bite the hand that feeds you your daily headlines. To see just how profound this sourcing filter can be, the text gives us a rather intense historical example. During the Cold War, global media outlets relied incredibly heavily on official sourcing and information, coming from right-wing experts and established disinformation networks. And through that specific institutional lens, the African National Congress, the ANC, was widely framed globally as terrorism. It shows precisely how relying entirely on established institutional sourcing can globally skew the perception of an entire movement. And this brilliantly illustrates the fourth filter we need to talk about, flack. What actually happens when a media outlet does decide to stray from the established consensus or dares to challenge those official sources? Well, they get hit with flack. This comes at them in the form of massively expensive lawsuits, intense political pressure, or highly organized complaint campaigns. It is a literal arsenal, designed specifically to discipline media outlets and drag them right back into line with the status quo. So, up to this point, we've seen how the market and institutional structures naturally sort of filter the news. But this brings up a absolutely crucial question to pivot our narrative today. What happens when the state itself actively fights back? What happens when it purposefully hijacks and manipulates these filters to its own advantage? Which brings us to Section 4, the threat of state capture. In modern governance, the threat of state capture is a massive, massive hurdle. It directly attacks the media ecosystem from the inside out. When the boards of public broadcasters become heavily politicized, like when leadership is chosen purely based on loyalty to a political faction rather than actual merit or journalistic integrity, editorial independence is completely compromised. The public broadcaster basically stops being an objective watchdog and just transforms into a political tool. So the really crucial point here is, how on earth does a democracy survive this? For South Africa to maintain democratic accountability, its media system essentially has to fight back by following 3 vital steps. Step 1, actively resist those structural and market biases we've been talking about. Step 2, vigorously fulfill its watchdog function by exposing corruption and policy failures, totally without fear. And Step 3, recognize that true independence isn't just about freedom from the state, it's about intentionally building an ecosystem grounded in rock-solid professional standards and deep public trust. Which leaves us with this final overarching thought for today's explainer. Can true editorial independence actually exist when the media is constantly being squeezed, caught right between the demands of corporate bottom lines on one side and the looming existential threat of state capture on the other? It is a complex, ongoing battle for the very soul of the Fourth Estate in the Global South, and the outcome dictates the version of reality we see every single day. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this architecture of power. Keep questioning those filters, and I'll catch you next time.